So I'd like to introduce Jim Bonham, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the ESOP Association. The ESOP Association is the voice of thousands of employee-owned firms in every state and the leading advocacy organization on ESOPs. Jim is thus in a unique position to tell you what his members have on their minds. Jim has held many senior leadership positions in congressional offices, including being Chief of Staff and congressional staff on many offices, and we're just delighted to have him talk about his wide experience. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Joseph. My comments say good morning, but it's afternoon now. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and briefly address this group, and I want to thank Maureen Conway and Matt Helmer for sponsoring the Ideas Forum and for once again inviting me to speak. This is now the third Aspen Ideas Conference, and for those of you who have heard me speak here before, you know that I can be rather direct. But each year, I also expect that as a result, I will not be invited back again the next year. But Maureen prevailed, and here I am again, but I promise again I will nevertheless continue to speak candidly. And recently, one of my all-time favorite senators, Alan Simpson, passed away. Being from Wyoming, my family knew Al well, and in the employee ownership community, it's almost gospel that we are a big tent movement, that everyone should be inside the tent. And it reminds me of a meeting I attended with Al once, where a group came in, and they started by noting that they were a big tent community, believing that this would ingratiate them to him. But Al, in his folksy, comical way, quickly dispatched that illusion by observing that in Wyoming, you learn that if your tent is too big, you're just leaving room for a bunch of rattlesnakes and grizzly bears. And you don't want either of them crawling into your bed. Folks, ESOPs are a precious thing. As an economic and policy idea, they are uncommon. Politicians on the left, the right, and the middle all agree that supporting ESOPs is good public policy. In our big tent efforts, I am fearful that we are becoming too loose in our delineation of what is and what is not employee ownership. We are allowing terms and concepts to become fuzzy around the edges in an effort to make a bigger tent. And I'm going to take just one form of employee ownership, the American ESOP, as an example, because that is the community of employee owners and businesses that I represent. It also happens to be the largest, by far, cohort of employee-owned businesses and employee owners by an extreme magnitude. An ESOP is a very specific thing. It has very specific requirements. An ESOP is required to have individual accounts for each plan participant. ESOP is required to tell those plan participants what their ownership allocation is every year. It must disclose how those allocations are made. It must tell the employees how much their ownership interest is worth every year. It must have an independent trustee and fiduciary who is accountable to those employee owners and holds the authority to act on their behalf. It is required to pay those employees the value they hold in their accounts if they leave the company, not just at retirement, but any time they leave the company. These are just some of the requirements. Now, why are these things required? Because they are some of the elements necessary to ensure that the public derives good in exchange for the favorable tax status provided to our ESOPs. Most specifically, the public interest in ESOPs was to create a mechanism by which average employees would enjoy more secure retirements because they are not only receiving wages, but they receive a growing interest in the value of the company that they're helping to build. This, in turn, would reduce the public exposure to the harm and costs associated with Americans being financially insecure in an old age, which was a serious problem in 1974 when ERISA and ESOPs were created. And you know what? Congress got it right. In the last 50 years, we have learned that ESOPs result in significantly more financial resources in retirement. They result in local job retention. They result in greater productivity, lower turnover. They result in local wealth retention, contributing significantly to the local economic multiplier effect, especially within our rural communities. They result in better employee benefits and a higher quality work environment that actually leads to better health outcomes. And the list goes on. And these benefits, this public good, has been proven through rigorous research conducted on actual ESOPs. Now, I've brought with me today a very useful thing. This is a pen. Pens are amazing. Who doesn't love a good pen? They make marks on paper, and you can write with them. Pens are said to be mightier than the sword. Y'all see my pen, right? This is ridiculous. We all know this isn't a pen. It's a pencil. It has no ink. It's made of wood and graphite. The marks that it makes can be erased and changed. Now, it doesn't make it bad, but I look silly standing up here calling this a pen when it's clearly a pencil. ESOPs have built a great deal of goodwill here in Washington. ESOPs have a very positive brand. For decades, through hard work and proven success, through research, we have proven and built a great deal of political capital. And for these reasons, the ESOP concept has become attractive to become associated with. We must jealously guard against false association with ESOPs and employee ownership. Merely calling something an ESOP does not make it so. Labeling something an ESOP or employee ownership does not mean it will produce the same outcomes or public good that ESOPs have produced. Now, I am a huge fan, and I mean this genuinely, of what Pete Stavros and KKR have done with a small portion of their investment portfolio in recent years. Ingersoll Rand is a powerful representation of what happens when private investors choose to align their interests with their employees through a modest grant of equity. Investors benefit when they include employees in the upside of the growth and value they are helping to create. Now, when Pete put in place the shared equity arrangement at Ingersoll Rand, turnover dropped, productivity increased, and when the company sold, some of that return was shared with those employees. And for some of those employees, it was genuinely life-changing. This is a very good outcome. It was an excellent management tool, but it is not an ESOP. It was progressive problem-solving for investors who face turnover and productivity issues. But these arrangements are not ESOPs. Why? What's missing? There's not a contract telling the employees what they do or don't own. There's no annual valuation disclosing to employees what their interest is worth. There's no fiduciary responsible for protecting the employees' interests. There's little to no transparency about the terms and conditions under which the employees may be paid. The employees don't get paid when they retire or leave the company. In fact, the entire goal is the opposite of permanence. They only get paid when the company gets sold. Now, it doesn't make these bad arrangements or something that should not be celebrated. But again, they are not ESOPs any more than this pencil is a pen. Now, why does this matter? Why do I talk about this? Because despite not being ESOPs, these types of arrangements are now being promoted as ESOPs for purposes of changing public policy. And that, the ESOP Association and our millions of employee owners and their companies cannot and will not abide. And here's why. There are two changes that are being sought in broad strokes. The first is an exemption from government and fiduciary oversight of the employee interests in these companies. No valuation requirements, no repurchase obligations, no annual disclosures or reporting. Second, they're seeking tax offsets equal to the value of the equity grant being made to the employees. Fundamentally, these private equity investment firms that institute these types of plan schemes want the taxpayer to provide the funding. This would almost certainly rise into the hundreds of billions of dollars, because why wouldn't you put in place a plan like this if Uncle Sam's going to pay the bill? The investors get the benefit of higher productivity, less turnover, better culture, and likely a higher return realized over a shorter period of time. The employees get a potential windfall when the company gets sold. But what about the taxpayer? What do we get? We get the bill. It is a transfer payment from the Treasury to a handful of employees lucky enough to work at one of these companies when it gets sold. And there is zero evidence that we get the same public good, such as local job retention. In fact, it is quite the opposite because the goal is to sell the company, not to ground it in the local economy. There's no evidence it will create more secure retirements. A big payday today does not mean a more secure retirement 15 years from now. In fact, experience tells us it is much more likely to mean a fancy new truck or boat in the driveway. But what really concerns me most is that if private investors are given this new tool for free, they will use it to buy out existing ESOPs and companies that would likely become ESOPs because they are most culturally aligned with this type of a mindset. The leading topic among ESOP CEOs is how to defend themselves from unwanted takeovers by private equity investors. If private equity is given the ability to go to an ESOP trustee and tell that trustee, not only will we pay you a multiple over your current valuation, which tend to be rather conservative to begin with, but your employees will still have an ownership stake after the acquisition. Those trustees who are already having a difficult time fending off private equity offers all the time will find it nearly impossible to say no. But there's even more reason why we oppose these tax breaks for private investors. Because by adding billions in additional taxpayer cost under the umbrella of ESOPs, they're putting at risk the very real and proven benefits of actual ESOPs, especially S-corporation ESOPs. ESOPs receive very modest tax incentives compared to the public good they create. And those incentives are largely, if not entirely, recovered when the employees receive their distributions as ordinary income in retirement and pay taxes as ordinary income. There's even an argument to be made that the increased ordinary income taxes being paid by employee owners is greater than the taxes that the corporation would have been paid had the ESOP not existed. By putting in place a private equity tax benefit and calling it an ESOP, the currently modest ESOP incentives get lumped into a much larger and more expensive pool. So look out next time that the Finance and Ways and Means Committee need revenues. Now listen, I love grizzly bears. I think they're cool to see at a distance, but I don't want them in my tent. And folks, this is not a pen, and those aren't ESOPs. Thank you for having me. Enjoy your conference. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.